Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. This is my first Horizons conference, so I'm very excited to be here. I got a chance to meet, I see some familiar faces from ICPR in Amsterdam in the room, so it's really nice to see some of you as well. My role today is to talk a little bit about what it will take, what we believe it will take for MDMA-assisted therapy to actually be available to patients commercially in the United States, and also talk about some of the factors that we're considering over the next few months on this short, although be it a very long road from initial trials all the way through to commercialization and availability to patients. Before I start, maybe just a little bit about me. I joined MAPS Public Benefit Corporation in March. So I've been here about 7 months. The introduction was great, and thank you for that. But I'm very happy to be here working on a few things that are really important. Number one, getting patients better treatment for PTSD is extremely important to me, but also providing innovation in the healthcare space. And I believe that what MAPS PBC is doing is at the very tip of a much larger spear for helping patients with their mental health treatment. So I'm really happy to be here and happy to talk through some of the opportunities and challenges that we're going to face. So just a bit of a disclosure. We're talking about the safety and efficacy in some cases of MDMA-assisted therapy, and it is currently under investigation. I will talk a little bit about our timelines and what we think those timelines will be. It's not yet approved by any medical and regulatory agency, and this document does not constitute an offer of securities. So first, let's start with what it is we do at MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. I'm assuming some of you know a little bit about us, but maybe I can provide a bit more context. Our vision is a world where all people have opportunities to heal and grow through the use of psychedelic medicines and therapies. Our role, our mission in that work is a bit more specific and unique. Our mission is to lead the research, development, and integration of psychedelic medicines and therapies into the healthcare system, prioritizing purpose over profits. That's really important to us because the way we are thinking is about how do we actually take MDMA-assisted therapy and integrate it into what we all know to be a very complex healthcare system with all of the factors that need to be considered to get patients care. So we have to start first with, what is MDMA-assisted therapy, because that will set up how it will be administered and how it will be thought of in practice, in clinical practice. So we know first it's a first-in-class treatment therapy. It has our breakthrough designated status from the FDA. That's really important for us, and we'll talk about how that affects our timelines, but also how it affects our interactions with regulators. It is a combination modality, and the first combination modality of a drug-assisted psychotherapy. This is a new concept, so many of the people in this audience have been talking about this for a few years. But for the reality of payers, providers, therapists, patients, the thought of taking a drug in a therapeutic context is not necessarily something that's done all the time. What's important to note about our program that many of you in this audience would know, but that we have to communicate more broadly, is that training is critical. Therapists need to have the opportunity to understand better how MDMA-assisted therapy works, the modality of that therapy, what was practiced in a clinical setting, in a research setting, and then how that will be applied to a more practical setting clinically. So some of our results that many may have seen I thought were worth sharing, because this is very exciting for payers. I think that was part of the discussion that just was brought up. We have to have good efficacy data, and our first phase 3 trial showed really fantastic results. First, a few things to note. The average length and duration of a patient suffering from PTSD in our trial was 14 years. And the way I always like to think about that is patients are frustrated. After 14 years of anything, let alone a very debilitating mental state, you're ready for treatment. You're ready for solutions. You're ready to get better. You're ready to live your life. And I think this represents well the population that we'll be first targeting as we think about getting to market. Our primary outcome measure, p-value, was very significant. We had a very evenly distributed, we believe, results across the different 15 sites, and we had zero serious adverse events, or SAEs, reported in the first phase 3 trial. And the two outcomes that we like to share consistently is that 67% of the patients lost their PTSD diagnosis. And what's so significant about this, if you go back to my first statistic about people suffering from PTSD, especially moderate and severe PTSD, is, think about that transition. 14 years of suffering from something and then going through a clinical protocol that took months and losing your PTSD diagnosis. It's just a huge shift in mental health care. And so while we see it on numbers in a slide, when we think about it from a patient perspective, it has a much different and more significant impact. 88% of participants found clinically significant improvement. So again, while they may not have lost their PTSD diagnosis, they had a much better quality of life. They saw a significant difference clinically, which means they're able to enjoy their life in a very different way than they were before. Now, of course, many of you would know that this has been, that this treatment and MDMA-assisted therapy in general has been receiving a lot of recognition. This is in general in the psychedelic movement, I would say, but also specifically to this treatment modality. And with that comes a lot of interest, and with that comes patient interest, and with that comes clinical interest, provider interest, and payer interest, which is all helpful to our momentum. So if you look at timelines, everybody's always interested in timelines, so I see a lot of cameras going up. So I guess this is a good slide to share. I don't think you're taking a picture of me with this headset on. So first of all, we published our phase 3 results back in 2021, and then we started MAP2. MAP2 is our second and confirmatory phase 3 program, or we hope it to be our confirmatory phase 3 program. We are finishing up that study sort of as we speak. It's actually really exciting to think about. Our enrollment was completed over the course of the summer. That meant that we had all the patients we need, and now it's a matter of them actually going through the end of the program. We'll do our interim analysis. We've done our interim analysis. We have our study execution happening toward the end of finish through the end of this year. And then we'll be submitting sometime in 2023, we best estimate Q3 of 2023, to the FDA. They need to then review and hopefully approve MDMA-assisted therapy. And then we have to go through a few other hurdles, which are DEA rescheduling and then launch. In parallel, I'd like to mention for some of my European colleagues in the room, MAP3 is, hopefully it will be starting. It's in process of starting, and our first patients will be hopefully enrolled in Q1 of next year. So I thought what would be interesting here in my remaining time is to talk a bit more about the logistics. Some of you might find this exciting, I hope. Some of you may find this, like really in the weeds, but I hope to just share that this is the stuff that it takes to bring a drug from a research stage to a available to patient stage. And that's the important work that we have over the next 18 months. So first, and we took this from a lens of questions that we always get. Number one, how is the clinical community going to ensure that we have really great care? Number two, what kinds of care settings might deliver MDMA-assisted therapy? Where are we going to spend our time? What settings make the most sense at first? And how will that evolve? How can enough therapists be trained to meet demand? So how can we make sure that we constantly have this limitation removed in certain geographies? And how might the the HTA's health technical assessments assess the integrated drug and therapy combination? I'll share some insights from payers that we've been receiving. So first, for any of you who've participated in like the pharmaceutical industry in large, you'll know that we like to break things down into like segments or buckets. So sorry, that's like the old pharmaceutical sector in me, but I think it just helps to understand where do we spend our time. And these are the 5 buckets that we're spending a lot of time here. First is around ensuring MDMA-assisted therapy is a standard of care. While this room, I would argue, is very well aware of the benefits of MDMA-assisted therapy, probably attends conferences regularly in this movement, most of the United States healthcare practice does not. So it is not a standard of care. It is some interesting thing that's happening at some conference in New York City during this week. We need to make that transition happen. Second is provider education and engagement. So we need to make sure that the healthcare providers who will be administering MDMA-assisted therapy have the proper education so that they deliver care in a very professional and high-quality way. Third is our clinic readiness. You know, it's not so easy to deliver 8 hours of therapy in a room. This is not just giving someone a pill and having them go home. This is actually considering your setting, your physical building, your infrastructure. And fourth would be accessibility. So how do we consider making sure that payers are covering, but that people also have access to things outside of payer coverage? So patient support programming to make sure that their out-of-pocket costs are not the barrier to them receiving care. And finally, patient awareness, which is, you know, once we have some of these things in order, there's a lot of patients out there suffering from PTSD who don't know this treatment will be available to them, and we need to work to make sure that they know it's available. So without going into the details, I'm going to highlight a few of the areas we're working on here. This just gives you an idea that there's a lot happening in parallel, and so if people want to find me for questions in the hallway or afterwards, I'm really happy to answer in more detail on some of these other factors that we're going to talk about. So just to orient you to the slides, because the next 3 or 4 are the same, I'm going to talk about what's our goal in this segment, what's the challenge that we're facing, and what's our approach. And on the right-hand side, you'll see some data that drives some of these decisions and how we work. So first of all, scientific engagement of leading PTSD researchers. It's really important that we educate people who treat PTSD. Some of them are in this room, many of them are not. And it's important to think about how people get their PTSD diagnosis today. So where do actually patients get that diagnosis from? Who are they seeing? Right? How does their care start? And if you look sort of left to right, you'll see that about 26% comes from psychiatrists, talk therapists, nurse practitioners, primary care providers. So you'll see that there's a pretty wide and diverse set of healthcare providers who actually diagnose PTSD. And then afterwards, so if you look 2 years post-diagnosis, what sort of treatment is a patient going through? Well, 2 years later, 44% are visiting a psychiatrist, 52% are visiting a talk therapist, and 26% are somehow co-managed. So the implication for us is that we need to actually find those healthcare providers and educate them to make sure that they're aware, to make sure that they're ready, and to make sure that they can refer patients appropriately. So second is partnering with people to provide broader education. So our goal here is to make sure that we can meet this demand among clinicians, and we have thousands of them who've already expressed their demand. Maybe some of you are in this room, but also maintain the quality of training for MDMA-assisted therapists. And it's hard to go fast with a large group of people and maintain quality. And for any of you who have been through MAP's training program, I think you probably could appreciate that, the attention to detail we spend in that training, and how do you do that in a room like this as opposed to a room of 50 people. So what we're doing is working with partners. We believe really strongly that we need a train-the-trainer model. So in other words, we cannot be the only people to provide training through our training program in order to reach the scale necessary across the United States and into other markets. So what we're going to do is work with partners to scale that training for us. So that means our training partners will be helping the training partners at other institutions to help them scale up their training programs and make sure that there's a wide variety of access. Some of you can make our training programs, and we're going to love to have you there. For those of you who can't, geographically, time, cost, getting away from your job, life, kids, whatever it might be, there may be other platforms that are better suited to you. We want to make sure that we partner with the ecosystem, and that's important for scale. Third, that's really important is thinking about how we support optimal care settings. And what we know is that behavioral health care settings, maybe I'll say it a different way. We know that MDMA-assisted therapy is intensive. We're talking about 8-hour sessions that require a lot of logistics and planning. So on the right-hand side, this graphic helps to illustrate the complexity that we're hoping to help providers and patients manage through what we would call a hub, or a centralized hub. And if you look at what's blue on the right-hand side, what you'll see is all of the different factors that we need to consider, things like adherence support, REMS program management, care coordination, prior authorization, financial assistance. These are all things that will be required by many people to actually get access to care. We also then have to manage things like the manufacturing, our patient, our payer, our provider, and the specialty pharmacy all will have to access in some way, shape, or form the information on this hub. So think about it. If you're a prescriber of MDMA-assisted therapy, you may not actually be delivering that care to that patient, but you're integral in that patient receiving care because you have to write a prescription. The therapist needs to know that that prescription was written. The patient wants to know, hey, did my doctor and my therapist coordinate my care, and do I have an appointment to show up to? All of those things have to happen in one place seamlessly. So what we'll be doing is working to make sure that that seamless interaction happens so that patients aren't discouraged by multiple communication platforms with a lot of different providers in navigating their healthcare. When we talk about drug coverage, I think this was in the panel just before me, when we talk about drug coverage, we're actually talking about two different types of coverage. And the challenge is that drug and therapy are covered under different parts of a payer's system. So for any of you in the room who've actually gone and talked to a payer, maybe you've worked for a payer, maybe you've worked as a customer of a payer, you'll know that it's complicated. But to make it simple, you have a pharmacy benefit, which covers the cost of a drug, in this case, MDMA. And on this hand, you have the behavioral health component of the payer, and they pay the therapist. Or as my wife would say, who is a therapist, they don't pay the therapist. Right? Just a little shout out to my wife there. So the interesting thing is that these two unique structures within the company, within the payer, don't talk to each other, like really at all. And so what's going to be important for us over the next 18 months or so as we go forward is to connect these two and explain the importance of connecting these two. So that work is complicated. It takes time. So there's data that they're used to seeing on the drug, safety, efficacy, et cetera. And on the behavioral health side, there'll be conversations that we can have. I think the challenge is going to be bringing those two things together to make sure that the overall payer can make decisions on coverage efficiently. So we've put some quotes up from some of the payers that we've talked to, and we've talked to a lot so far. It means multiple prior authorizations and copays. The drug through the pharmacy and therapy care, behavioral or medical, depending on the site of care. We'll want providers to have special training to do this treatment. Behavioral health care has a structural problem. So there are lots of institutional issues that we need to help providers solve for. The good news, which I don't necessarily highlight on this slide, is that every payer who we've talked to believes very strongly that mental health is an issue and they're trying to find solutions. And thirdly, on those that we've presented data to so far, they're extremely encouraged by the data. And I think that was highlighted in the panel just before me. If you have compelling data, you have a great place to start. So finally, I'm going to close and leave plenty of time here for Q&A. But I want to bring this back to the work that we're trying to do here at MAPS PBC, which is about helping people who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder as a start, and then broadening to the wider ecosystem and supporting mental health care. We have lots of challenges, but that's why we're here. That's why we do the jobs that we do. That's why I'm really blessed to have fantastic coworkers at MPBC helping us to work through, and a lot of stakeholders in this room supporting us to do this great work. But our goal is to really put a dent in this 350 million people who suffer from PTSD every year around the world. I appreciate the time and look forward to talking more in the questions. I think we have lots of time for questions.
We have plenty of time.
Good.
And we have plenty of questions.
I like questions better then.
I would love to hone in on the reimbursement issue. You mentioned your wife not getting paid by the payers, right? And I think this is something that probably a lot of therapists in the room are wondering about. Reimbursement rates for therapists are extremely low, which causes a lot of the really good ones not to go into network. And as you're thinking about building out the provider network with ideally the best providers, how are you thinking about persuading them to offer these therapies when, assuming we get coverage, they could get a lot more by staying out of network?
Yeah. So it's a fantastic question. I think as many of us know who either go to therapy, have family members who are therapists or work in the space, therapists are really incented today because of supply and demand to be out of network, right? If you're just prioritizing financials for themselves. So I think there's going to be two things that happen that we'll work toward. One is ensuring that people who need access to in-network coverage have access to it. The second is the fact that we have two different payer coverages. One is the drug, as I mentioned earlier, and one is the behavioral health component. I think there will be instances where people will be able to see their preferred behavioral health provider who they have a sort of cash pay relationship with and the drug benefit of MDMA. And I think there will be a world in which that works. I don't think that that's going to be the majority of the number of patients that we hope to serve. When you look at the roughly 12 million people in the United States that the VA estimates have PTSD, a majority of those 12 million will best be served through payer coverage. I don't know the exact stat. I think that was covered before. But it's a highly significant majority. So we have to remember who we're trying to serve in terms of volume of patients to have the most impact.
And staying maybe on the topic of cost, which has been very dominant in the previous discussions, how are you thinking about groups as you're rolling this out? And is this a research question or is it a commercialization question? Yeah,
it's first a research question. So the conversation of group therapy is one that comes up often, and we're doing some work right now in terms of investigator-initiated trials on group therapy. Group therapy, I think, is a really exciting modality for MDMA and something that we need to look into a lot further, and we'll continue to do research, toward that end. But the indication is going to be the thing that drives payer coverage. So when we talk to the payers so far, what the payers will start to look for is PTSD diagnoses, number one, as a sort of like a line in the sand of like, is this treatment going to be right for you? They'll be looking at the indication that we eventually get from the FDA, which is our label. Number two, so they'll find PTSD, and then is there other criteria that they need to think about? But they won't move right away into sort of group therapy context. They would need certainly a payer is going to need a label. Now that being said, I think from a research perspective, more work needs to be done on the benefits of MDMA-assisted therapy in a group practice, or in a group setting, I should say. And we're going to be supporting that research. I think it's a really important way to think about how we bring MDMA-assisted therapy beyond just the PTSD patient.
And staying on the topic of care settings, can you give us a little bit of an overview of the types of settings that you're envisioning and how you imagine patients will distribute across the different settings and how many people will be providing? Because I think, in the current clinical trial protocols, we have 2 providers, right? What will it look like in the real world? I think there's a lot of curiosity in the room from potential therapists around who will be delivering this therapy.
Who's delivering care in the room?
Yeah.
Yeah, so as many of you may know, in our clinical program, the way our clinical protocol was set up is we had 2 co-therapists in the room. We believe that this will be governed by a few things. Number one, what's actually in the label. So it is a question, will the FDA actually require a very specific number and type of healthcare providers in the room? What we do know about the FDA is that they don't regulate therapy. What we also know about the FDA is they've never been in this position before. So I think it's important to note that that is an outstanding question. What we hope, ideally, is that more and more flexibility will be given to make sure that broader and broader access is available to patients. But we want to first start with great quality care. And that's going to be first probably more closely aligned to our clinical program, and then over time, I think when treatment shows safety, effectiveness in the real world, I think we'll start to see more and more varieties of the people in the room, whether that be one or two, or the different types of people, and the licenses required of people in those rooms.
And maybe you can just give a super brief, introduction to the business model, because there are lots of questions around, like, once this gets approved, is only MAPS going to be able to offer MDMA therapy?
Yeah, so maybe a few things, I guess, about how this would work in the real world, and if there's other variations and I don't answer, please let me know. First of all, it's really important to understand how a care team or a group of healthcare providers supporting the patient is going to work in this setting. And I'll just bring back an example. If I'm a patient who's suffering from PTSD, in many cases, over 40% of the time, I'm already seeing a psychiatrist. And in many cases, I'm seeing a therapist. And depending on the license of that therapist and depending on the state, that therapist, in many cases, is probably not able to prescribe me a drug. And in most cases, the psychiatrist is able to prescribe me the drug. So let's take both of those cases. If I see a psychiatrist, well, that psychiatrist could do both, recommend and prescribe MDMA-assisted therapy to me once and if approved. But then I need to go find a trained MDMA-assisted therapist that I would actually conduct the training, that I would actually go and participate. And those two may be different people. And I'm assuming, and my assumption is in most cases, in the beginning especially, they will be different people. And so that requires coordinated care, not just on the prescription, payer, how do I get this reimbursed side, but then also, making sure the patient has the best care. That psychiatrist probably wants to hear from the therapist who conducted the MDMA sessions to make sure that patient gets proper follow-up and proper support and proper integration after the therapeutic treatment. So I think this is going to be the nuance. So if I'm a psychiatrist who wants to get my patients access to care, there's no real business model. You're going to be referring them to get some care as if you might refer them some other type of mental health treatment. If you're an MDMA practicing therapist and you are the one who will actually conduct the care, you will have in most cases, no real business transaction. So we're talking about business models here. You'll have no real business transaction with the MDMA. The MDMA would have been prescribed by someone else, and it will be delivered for the patient to be taking in your care. So there's no sort of financial or payer transaction that's happening ahead of time. So really for a therapist, it's going to be about your time. It's going to be about being reimbursed for your time. And one of the things we're doing, it was mentioned, I think, by Elliot before I got up, is working on the CPT code to ensure that there is a proper CPT code so that therapists can bill for that amount of time and hopefully at an improved rate. I hope that answers that question.
It did, yeah.
Okay.
At least for me. As you think about scaling this, you've shown us, a few different of the topics that you're working on, but what in your mind right now is the biggest roadblock? Is there anything that's keeping you up at night?
There's lots of things keeping me up at night. So I think, the first thing, and this was a question that was asked of me recently in Amsterdam, and Harlem, sorry, not Amsterdam, next to Amsterdam. It's really about quality of care for therapists, and I should say quality of training for therapists. We take great, care in the fact that patients suffering from PTSD need very special attention, and they need good quality care. And we also take great care in the fact that MDMA-assisted therapy may be the first psychedelic-assisted therapy in a legalized market. And that the first months of patients being treated are absolutely critical to the reputation of our industry, the reputation of our work, and will set a stage for everything thereafter. So the thing that's most important to me is really, who are those first centers of excellence? Who are the therapists in the room with patients in those first few months? How is that care delivered, and how do we support patients to have really fantastic outcomes? So when we think about launch, in our company, in a public benefit corporation, we think about it differently than maybe my history in a pharmaceutical company, where you're thinking about like, how quickly can you scale? In our case, what we're actually thinking about is, how can we make sure the quality is scaled appropriately? And that's just a very different mindset for us to have. And we're trying to remind ourselves of that every day to make sure that we get the quality right in the beginning, because I think that's so important. So that's what really keeps me up. If it goes too fast, and if therapists aren't properly trained, and we have some bad results, or patients aren't taken care of appropriately in the first months, that wouldn't be good for anyone.
So there's a lot of questions about the FDA from the audience. So let's speak a little bit about the FDA. So this is a drug therapy combination modality, which is new to the patients, new to the providers, and new to the FDA.
Yep.
How does that impact the process, and to what degree do you anticipate that the FDA will regulate the therapy component? Maybe you can talk a little bit about REMS.
So first of all, maybe I'll just give like an anecdotal story. So when I first joined MAPS PBC, Amy and Rick and others, who probably many of you know, were like, Mike, we have this great relationship with the FDA. They've been so supportive. They've been, very collaborative in their approach. And I said, yeah, that's really nice. No bias, I understand. And I had the opportunity to have my first engagement with the FDA as a member of our company just a few weeks ago. And I have to say, it really exceeded my expectations. I think the FDA, and I don't want to speak to the FDA, nor am I allowed to speak for the FDA, so I'm just giving you my personal impression. I really was impressed by the FDA's willingness to work collaboratively to find appropriate solutions that work within the confines of their regulation, but also within the confines of our ability to do research. So I truly believe that I was working at that moment with a partner, and that our teams were working with a partner. And I have to say, I've been in industry for over 20 years, and I worked and lived in a bunch of different countries, interacted with a bunch of different regulators. That was the more collaborative meeting I've ever been a part of. So I do believe, and I want to give FDA some credit here, that I do believe the approach, at least in this review rooms so far, has been quite collaborative. So we hope to keep that. We did, as we said, we do assume that there will be a REMS, and a REMS is a risk mitigation strategy that will be put in place. So that will be the right of the FDA to impose. That's their jurisdiction. The FDA does not have jurisdiction on therapy, right? And so I think that's just important for everyone to note. And so this is the first drug-assisted therapy. So the FDA is really thinking about, like, how do we do this? How do we regulate within our own bounds, and then how do we make sure we don't overstep, but also make sure that patients are given appropriate care? I think that's going to come a lot at the state level. So we are doing work at the state level to reschedule. So this is about, how do you move MDMA from a Schedule 1 to Schedule 2 or 3? And then in that, the states will also have to think about, how do they consider a therapist is trained or not? For those therapists in the room, you'll know, of course, that like your state is the one that grants you your license, and then there's some reciprocity between some states. But then you can get certifications in many different types of therapies and use them in your own practice, kind of how you please. That's a bit generalized. So we don't know exactly how that's going to work for MDMA. I do think the controller in this will be, in many cases, the payer, because I think the payer will want to make sure that their patient that they're paying for is going to a trained therapist. And so I do think that for those of you interested in providing MDMA-assisted therapy, or therapists who want to do that, they'll have to in some ways register, and that's going to be some of the work I explained on the hub of how do we get people who've been through our training program or other certified training programs to have that sort of check mark so that Aetna or Cigna or United patients know that, in my case, therapist MULLETTE is appropriately trained.
You opened with speaking a little bit about the PBC model and its uniqueness, and your background is in traditional for-profit pharma. Mm-hmm. How has it impacted the way you run the operations organization? Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the reasons I came to MAPS PBC was to figure that out. I think Amy and Rick from the beginning have a great mission to say how can we develop a pharmaceutical-like research company in a way that is different from traditional pharmaceuticals. So first of all, I'll say, what is a public benefit corporation? Because, Horizons is a public benefit corporation too, right? What does that mean? So in the United States, you have for-profit companies and you have not-for-profit companies, and squarely in the middle are public benefit corporations. And public benefit corporations are for-profit companies. So our parent, MAPS, is a not-for-profit company, and our company, the PBC, is a for-profit company. But we are able to and must redirect those funds to a public good. And in this case, that's our research and mental health care. So I think really what it's going to come down to is finding the people who are mission aligned to our work, and I think we do that right now through our interview process and the types of people we've brought on board. I think also it will really show itself with patient support. Traditional pharmaceutical companies, and you'll know this from television ads, if you can't afford your medication, please, call 1-800, fill in the name of the pharmaceutical company. Those are patient support programs. Though they only go so deep, typically in pharmaceutical companies, I think MAPS PBC has an opportunity to support patients differently and hopefully more effectively. So I think that's really where the rubber is going to meet the road. In I would say the biggest way, in the way that everyone can feel it more tangibly. All right, we'll have time for one or two more questions. You talked a little bit about the topic of education, and obviously within the psychedelic bubble, we're all, very convinced and bought in, but how are you thinking about raising awareness for this treatment to potential future patients and those providers that are not yet in the psychedelic bubble?
So we had in Harlem a few weeks ago, we had this great panelist who raised this great question to the audience. And the panelist asked, by a show of hands, how many people in this room have had a psychedelic experience or know someone who has, right? And I won't ask that question here because it was sort of obvious, right? Everyone in the room sort of raised their hand. I think if you went to the American Psychiatric Association meeting or the AMA meeting or another similar medical conference and you asked that question, you would have a very different response, very different. And I think what we all have to do is remind ourselves of that, because the efforts that we need to do, the work that we need to do over the next months for MDMA-assisted therapy is by getting that bolus, that let's call it 90-something% of the healthcare population educated on MDMA-assisted therapy, the clinical work, the data, the research that's been done, the rigor, just to get everybody to a level playing field. And that's no small task. And so I think that's where the work starts, and that's what we're going to look forward to doing over the next 18 or 24 months. Cool. All
right, one more question. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between PBC and MAPS, the mother organization, with the different agendas?
Rick's laughing. I don't know why Rick's laughing. We have a wonderful relationship, so we can start there. Look, I think there's a few things maybe to note. We are in a very unique structure, right? We have a 501c3 not-for-profit parent. organization, and we are a subsidiary, wholly owned subsidiary, that is essentially a research, development, commercialization pharmaceutical company. And how does that relationship work? So I think, in full transparency, we're still working through that every single day. But the basis is we have an independent structure at the PBC. We have independent employees. We have an independent board. We do our work in an independent way according to our own business rules, but we have a reporting relationships with the MAPS organization. And I think that helps, because what that does is that keeps us honest to our mission and our vision, and holds us accountable to the mission and vision that we've all set forward, and makes sure people like me and Amy and others in our leadership organization always make sure we have a check and balance at the end of the day. So I'm fortunate to work with two fantastic boards, and that just, is another reason I'm up all night.
That's a good note to close on.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.